Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Kate Murdoch is a Melbourne-based author of 2 historical fiction titles, a host of short stories, and an internationally exhibited painter. Her new novel, The Orange Grove, published by Regal House Publishing, is due to be released shortly, and what a delightfully entertaining read. Full of intrigue and heart-stopping tension, this beautifully written book offers a glimpse into the precarious position occupied by women in 18th century France. It's a remarkable study of domestic politics within a patriarchal society complicated by nobility and wealth that will have you turning pages into the wee hours. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Kate to the podcast today. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. I wanted to congratulate you on the impending publication of your second book. It's very exciting.
It is indeed. Thank you.
Now, early reviews are universally positive, and how does that make you feel?
I'm very excited, and it's really, when you spend a long time writing and researching a book, and then you have positive reception. It's really, you couldn't wish for more than that. That's just really why you do it, and it makes it worthwhile.
Now, your first novel, The Stone Circle, it was set in 16th century Italy, and now this new one is 18th century France. What is it, do you think, about these bygone eras that draws you to them?
Well, I mean, it's for different reasons with Stone Circle. I was very much interested in the alchemy side of things, which was involved a lot of research. But with The Orange Grove, I was actually more interested in how those times affected relationships and how it affected behaviours because of the incredible pressure that people were under with the very strict class system and the lack of a safety net if they failed to sort of maintain their status or failed to, in the case of the peasants, weren't able to produce enough food to feed their families. But I've focused obviously more on the position of nobles than the peasants.
So was there a particular spark of inspiration that, led you to start writing The Orange Grove?
Yes, there was. I actually was reading a book by Henri Say, which was kind of an academic book, and it had a quote in it which I could read to you about a noble at the time, and I shall read it to you. It was by an actor called Fleury, and he said, "The Prince of Soubise was not content to throw gold in the path of his queens of the boudoir. There are a dozen of them. Since he gave each one of them the same household, the same livery, and an equipage of the same kind, people remarked when they saw the carriages of his mistresses passing, 'Here comes the family of Soubise.'" So that's really all it took to get me started on, this incredible rabbit hole of research and investigation, really, because I just thought, well, how are those women going to get along, and what kind of rivalry is going to take place? Would they have formed friendships? Would there be complete antipathy, or would there be some positivity within that? And so I suppose I've explored both those outcomes, because there are friendships among the women in the chateau, but there's also a lot of hostility, as you would have discovered.
Yes, indeed. Now, I was going to say that, obviously I've been very fortunate to be able to have read this book already. But for those who haven't read it, can you tell me what it's about?
Yeah, so it's about a woman who is a mistress to a duke, and she's forced to choose between position and morality when a new mistress comes into the fold and the duke falls in love. And prior to this, he hasn't really fallen in love with his mistresses. And so the Duchess becomes incredibly jealous. And Henriette, I suppose she has a strong sense of fairness, and she wants to kind of help this girl. And at the same time, she's had a friendship with the Duchess. And she knows that if she defends Letitia, that her position is going to be very much compromised. So, this throws up all kinds of problems, and things start to kind of unravel when Henriette makes a decision to, get behind this girl and defend her.
It is an incredibly intriguing story. And I wanted to say that not so long ago, I spoke to another Kate on this podcast, Kate Forsyth. Her new book, The Blue Rose, was set in 18th century revolutionary France, some 80 years after the events of your book. And we were talking about the
Yes.
difficulties faced by women of noble birth, their lack of rights and self-determination, which kind of linked them with their poorer counterparts and which also failed to save many of them from Madame Guillotine. Now, your book addresses similar issues, but you've given us a glimpse of how such inequities operated on a very real level for women of the time. It seems abhorrent to modern women that it was an acceptable occupation for both wives and mothers to become one of many mistresses to a wealthy man in order to save themselves from destitution. But it was the reality of the time, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think there was a lot of desperation because, to be sort of accepted in the court, there were so many obstacles that had to be overcome. You had to have the noble lineage, you had to potentially be presented to the king, you had to prove your lineage, and it was very, very difficult. And I think, obviously, I'm not kind of addressing that so much. I'm talking about more the domestic politics and the power struggle there. But I suppose I was thinking of that bigger picture as I wrote, and the stakes, which were so high for every level of society, other than obviously the king himself, who was kind of exempt from all of this. He was more like a god within that system. But I think for women it was very hard. But I've kind of, I think, when you take away that autonomy or that power, it tends to kind of degenerate into this more emotional struggle, I suppose, power dynamics. So, yeah, I was very interested in that and how that would kind of take place.
Following from all of that, how much research did you have to do for this book?
A lot. Yeah, I mean, I sort of a lifetime of being interested in everything French and numerous visits to France. Anyway, and I speak French, and so it's very much something that had been part of my life. But obviously there was still a lot of research that had to be done. So I read a lot of the diaries of the time. So there was some by Madame de Sévigné, which were they were fantastic. She had a very strong voice, so I found that her voice tended to kind of seep into some of my characters. I think her voice is a little bit in Duchess Charlotte, and in terms of that piousness as well. She was a very religious woman, and a few of my characters kind of ended up taking that on as well. So there was her, and there was also Elizabeth Charlotte, Madame Palatine, who was the wife of the Duc d'Orléans, who was Louis XIV's brother. And she was more kind of an amusing, her diaries, she was very straightforward, she was very down to earth. She loved, just being in nature, getting sunburnt, she didn't really enjoy all the intricacies of court life. And so her perspective was really interesting too. And I read Louis XIV's diaries as well. And I sort of looked at portraits in the Louvre. I looked at reconstructed interiors there as well. Read fiction books. A lot of interesting pathways were taken to sort of, enrich this story.
Indeed. Now, was the chateau in the Orange Grove based on a real place?
No, it wasn't. I just conjured that up. It was fun to kind of imagine that environment.
You address many themes in this book, Kate, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of noblesse oblige, the idea that someone with power and influence should use their social position to help other people. But the Duc d'Amboise took that principle to another level, didn't he?
I don't see him as being particularly compassionate, to be honest. I don't see those actions as being someone who's trying to be kind. I think he's really just looking out for himself.
Yeah.
Whereas there are characters that, are interested in helping others, like the Marquis d'Hervé, who is at court in order to rebuild a village near his estate. But as far as the Duke goes, there's a lot of selfishness and a lot of self-serving behaviour. I mean, he's not a nasty person, but he's very much, it's just all about what he wants and what will make him happy.
So I was wondering where you got your inspiration for the Duke. I mean, was he based on a real life character, or is he, a composite character?
I think he's probably composite. Certainly not a specific person that I've dealt with myself. I think the idea of the distant man, the man that's sort of really, only half emotionally there, was interesting, because I think, when you've got people like that, people tend to kind of pedal faster. Do you know what I mean? They kind of try really hard because they want, the people that are around, I suppose, narcissistic people in a way. They, the people that are wanting their love try very hard to kind of obtain it. And, there's all these very sad scenes with, the Duchess sort of just wanting to be loved and just wanting his attention and affection, and she feels it's her due in a way, but it sort of isn't. It doesn't quite happen.
Yeah, speaking of the Duchess, I mean, I actually found her to be quite an intriguing character. She was obviously quite flawed, but I felt a level of sympathy for her that I didn't want to feel.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that, because I really wanted to show that vulnerability along with the negative actions, and because that was kind of one of the themes that I was exploring in the book, was the idea of the ambiguity of morality. How, negative acts can happen not because someone's, being malicious, but because they've had incidences in their past that they're processing, and they're also dealing with, the immediate situation at hand. And in her case, it was definitely both. She'd grown up with very distant parents, and, and she just really is crying out for love throughout the novel. And so she's certainly one example where I was exploring that. As in, also Celine was another character where I was kind of exploring those ideas of morality, and I suppose having a bit more compassion and empathy for people in their actions, and thinking, well, sometimes negative actions are truly evil, as we know. But there's a lot of instances where, if you sort of were to question a person about what they're doing, they might be kind of justifying it to themselves. And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, each of the mistresses, obviously have their reasons for being there and for, putting themselves in that situation. And you feel a level of sympathy for each one of them. I mean, some harder than others. Obviously Celine was quite difficult to feel empathy for. But I think we get there in the end because of how they've been treated. And yeah, I mean, just talking about the Duchess, I mean, it must have been, just thinking about it as a woman, as a wife, to have to share your husband with 5 other women.
Unbearable.
It would be unbearable. And not just to have to share your husband with 5 other women. You have to live with them and face them over the breakfast table every day. I just found it an incredible burden for one woman to bear, and to wake up and be happy every day.
Yeah, it's just an untenable situation, and added to add insult to injury, he's not even particularly respectful of her. He doesn't try and make up for it in any way. He doesn't sort of really offer her any affection. So, she feels just as used and just as kind of toyed with, in fact, as the mistresses. So, it's not much fun for her. She doesn't have a barrel of laughs.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, it does say a lot about that patriarchal society, and it was something that I've, spoken about previously in other podcast interviews, that despite position in society that the Duchess occupies, that she's still not much better than the women who don't have the same position that she does, and easily replaced in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, she has absolutely, no emotional security. Her material security is flimsy, really, because, he's just sort of threatening to kind of, well, I don't want to give away too much,
yes, I agree.
She, it can turn on a dime at any moment, and, she's very much aware of that. And I think also the fact that she hasn't been able to provide him with an heir, further kind of exacerbates her situation. or her vulnerability, I suppose. So yeah, it's not easy. And in some ways, Henriette, who is really, I suppose, my protagonist, I didn't plan it, but when I've looked back on the story and how she's, her character, she's kind of like the calm kind of anchor in the story, because everyone else is having all these emotional moments, and she keeps very measured for most of the story. I mean, she does have some times where she is upset, of course. She is like an anchor in the story, and I don't know if you found her that way when you were reading, but yeah, and her morality too. I've played that, the fact that that's so important to her, her ideals, and then that's kind of challenged by the situation she finds herself in. She has to kind of think about that and think about what I was mentioning before about the spectrum of morality. She has to kind of examine her attachment to her ideals.
She's an interesting character as well, because there are things in her past that she has to come to grips with, bearing in mind that steady morality that she has portrayed right throughout the book. And I think that's her one downfall, and it's the thing that comes back to bite her in the end.
Yeah, I think that if I had sort of had her as an emotional character like the others, the balance of the book wouldn't have been there.
Yeah.
I think it really needed someone who wasn't completely losing it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, she is the voice of reason, without a doubt.
Yeah, but you're right in saying that it does, it in some ways comes across as inflexible at some points in the story, because she's just so attached to people behaving within the parameters of her ideals that, yeah, it is kind of harmful to her, and she realizes that.
Moving away from the book for a moment, you've been open about the fact that you were adopted as an infant and later reconnected with your birth parents. I wondered if you thought that this part of your story gave rise to your need to express yourself creatively.
Creativity has just been very inherent to me. It's something that, from a very young age, I was always drawing, I was always writing stories. But it certainly gives me material to play with. And I'm sure you've noticed in the story there are children that are hidden, there are children that are... There is that kind of thread in the story. And so these type of secret children do tend to emerge in my novel. And so it's certainly, I think it's definitely in my subconscious a lot of the time. Yeah, it just gives me interesting material.
So could you tell me a little bit more about what prompted your switch from painting to writing?
Yeah, well, that was kind of gradual. I had been exhibiting at a gallery in Melbourne. I was an artist in residence, and the gallery closed down. So I was sort of at a bit of a crossroads where I was looking at, getting another gallery. And around that point, I started writing a manuscript. And it was a supernatural thriller, and I wrote it within sort of 8 months. And the next thing I knew, I was just obsessed with I mean, I'd always been a writer, but I'd kind of put it aside when I became an artist. But it was always nagging at me, this idea that I might write a novel one day. But I sort of thought, oh, look, that's probably not going to happen. But then this story came to me. It came through a dream about a certain character, and it was kind of like I became a bit obsessed with it all, and I met other people who were interested in writing, and I joined a writers group, and just things started to progress. And the next thing I knew, it had sort of taken over my life, and painting had taken a back seat. So it certainly wasn't a planned thing. It just evolved of its own accord. And then I went back to study for a year at Swinburne. I was on a website called Autonomy, run by HarperCollins, and that was really integral because I was, critiquing other people's work. They were critiquing mine, and I think when you're doing that, you learn so much about craft. And I must have critiqued, almost hundreds of other writers, and also been critiqued so much myself. And so that was a really important stage. And then I started writing a lot of short stories, and then they started getting published. And then I got an agent, and then Stone Circle was picked up sort of maybe a year later. And yeah, gradual, but the word I'm thinking of is inexorable.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same word. One of my favourite words, I have to say.
Yeah, it sort of felt fated, it just felt like, yeah, this is what I'm meant to be doing. And I'm someone that has always followed my instincts. I place a lot of store in instincts, and everything in me was screaming at me to follow this thread, follow this path. And even though it came quite late in life, and it certainly wasn't expected. So, I mean, painting had been, and it still is a great love, but it had been my whole life, So if you had have told me, in those years where I was a visual artist that, oh no, one day you won't be doing that, you'll be an author, I would have just laughed. I would have said, what are you even talking about?
Yeah.
It's not something I would have imagined.
So I think it begs the question, do you still paint?
Yeah, not as much as I would like to. I just don't have the time anymore. So maybe once every couple of months I might pick up a brush, it's a bit sad. I have a studio. I'm not ever going to dismantle my studio because I think that would be the absolute death knell. If it's not sitting there, then it's already not happening very much. And if it wasn't there, it wouldn't happen at all. So one day I might be able to do both. Who knows?
Now, I understand that you recently travelled to Croatia, where your birth mother came from. Is that the first time you've been there? And how did that come about?
Yes, it is the first time, and I've been wanting to go for years. And yeah, well, we had a family trip, and we were going to France and various places. And my husband, he knew that it was important to me that I go there, and so he just said, "How about we go?" And I said, "Yeah, great." And so we cruised around the Dalmatian Islands, and it was really emotional when I first arrived there. When I stepped off that plane, I was, I felt really moved to be there. And then I started seeing all these people that look a little bit like me, and it's just incredibly special. And I felt really, it's a wonderful culture. It's really dynamic, and really, there's great nightlife. There's great music, the food. Obviously, the landscape is incredible. I felt really, very happy to be there.
So, Kate, what's next? Are you working on anything else at the moment?
I am. So I'm working on a novel, the second draft of a novel called The Glass House, which is set in 1920 in Palermo in Sicily. So on the same trip where I went to Croatia, I was also on a research trip. The family went home, and I went on to Palermo for a week to sort of iron out some of the finer details of this manuscript and sort of visit all the locations in the narrative. So that was an incredible experience as well. And I ended up having to change one of the locations because there was an inaccuracy. There was something that wasn't quite right with a convent that I'd set some of the story in. So that was, I was just felt so incredibly privileged to be able to do that. That was wonderful. And from going to Croatia, I've actually got another manuscript, which is a first draft, which is a dual timeline story set in Melbourne in 1960s and Croatia during World War II. So there's a lot going on in my head right now with these two projects. But I'm really excited about both of those stories.
Fantastic. So I wanted to ask if you were touring or doing any events locally for the Orange Grove.
Yes, so I'm doing a number of events here in Melbourne, and I'm also going up to Sydney in February to do an event in a bookshop up there, Anna's shop in Cronulla.
Lovely, in my area.
Yes. And so I'm doing sort of a library event here, and I'm doing a couple of bookshops. I'm doing first chapters in March. And then there's the Bayside Literary Festival next year. So there's a number of events, and it's all on my website, on my events page. So, but the first, the most important one is my launch at Readings on November 7th in St Kilda. So that will be, really exciting night. I'm looking forward to that.
Now, Kate, I wanted to ask you, if you had 3 tips to give to an aspiring or emerging writer, what would they be?
Persistence is obviously number one, just keeping going. And I mean, there's so many points where you could feel, like giving up and like it's all too hard, because it is, a really tough industry to break into, but you've got to persist. And you've got to also, number 2 would be self-belief, because no one else can do that for you. You've got to have that, within yourself, that you have something to offer, you have a story to tell. And not only that, but everyone's story is unique to them, and no one else is going to tell it in exactly the same way. So, to have that strength and that self-belief is incredibly important. And number 3, now that's a tough one. Let me think about that for a moment. I think it would be to write consistently, but you don't have to write a lot. So in my case, I would sit down and write 500 words as a benchmark. If I exceed that benchmark, that's great. But as long as, someone else might set a higher word count, but if you set a word count and you sit down consistently and write that every day if you can, then, you're going to end up with a book. But you've just got to actually have that discipline to sit down and write that, whatever word count it is that, you set for yourself.
Thanks for that. So then I wanted to ask you, if listeners wanted to connect with you, how could they do that? Where can they find you?
Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, my Facebook page. I have an author page. So just all the usual social media places.
It was such a pleasure to chat to you today. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Claudine. I really appreciate it.
Now, listeners, for your chance to win a copy of Kate's beautiful new novel, The Orange Grove, head over to my Instagram account or Facebook page and follow the prompts to win. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.